So it's a pleasure today. We're going to listen to Devon Schiller from the University of Vienna and to Brian Khumalo from the University of Florida. Okay. The lecture is a transdisciplinary research grounded in cutting-edge biosemiotics. The principal aim is to address Parkinson's disease. The format of our webinar, generally it takes about 2 hours. And the first 50 minutes will be the presentation of the paper, and then I will call the panelists, and we have several, and I will check if everybody is on board. And each one will have about 5 minutes to make the remarks and to ask questions. And then after all the panelists finish their remarks, then the presenters are going to answer the questions in the way they want to. So the title of the talk today is Motor Health and Semiotic Function in the Kinesthetic Expressivity of Neurodegenerative Disease. Okay, Brian, you may start, please.
Fabulous. Well, good morning, evening, afternoon to everybody on the panel. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much to everybody who has organized this and invited myself and Devon to give a talk on motor health and semiotic function in the kinesthetic expressivity of neurodegenerative disease, which we also call MAST, a project that is funded graciously by the Marie Curie Staff Exchange as part of the European Union's Horizon Europe Research Innovation Program. So my name is Brian Khumalo. I am a PhD at the University of Florida. I'm in the anthropology department. And Devon and I have been working on this project alongside a number of our colleagues for about a year now. And what MAST is a multidisciplinary applied research project that is grounded in cutting-edge biosemiotics. The principal aim is to address Parkinson's disease, its symptomatic hypomimia, which is also called facial masking, which is kind of where the name MAST comes from, and the increasing technological demand for early indicating detection techniques. So as part of the MSc, the Marie Curie Staff Exchange, our project through interdisciplinary, international, and intersectoral secondments will have researchers trained in world-leading measurement techniques, including the Facial Action Coding System, or FACS, and the Neuropsychological Gesture Coding System, or NEUROGES, as well as world-leading measurement technologies, including iMotions' Affectiva and Noldus' FaceReader. And in this novel advancement of applied biosemiotics that harnesses objective quantitative methods, what we hope to do is to apply statistical analysis of empirical laws, which are also called linguistic laws, to the scientific measure of non-verbal facial behaviors. And so the objective of MAST encompasses developing innovative solutions for non-invasive symptom assessments based on quantifiable differences between unmasked or healthy faces, as well as masked Parkinsonian faces as a function of hypomimia. Now, this will include, for instance, the cross-sectoral differences from one face to another in the comparison between ages, genders, racial groups, ethnic groups, among other demographic factors. It will also include longitudinal differences from one face to itself, with changes over time in the longitudinal course of the disease progression. Now, the emergent applications in e-health for what we term automated Parkinson's hypomimia analysis, or APHA, utilize artificial intelligence, computer vision, and machine learning. So through e-health technologies and their effective computing, the practical solutions innovated by MAST may potentially sustain not only long-term applicability over diagnostic, prognostic, and therapeutic stages of the disease, but also wide-ranging utility for provider, caregiver, and patient stakeholders in its treatment. Ultimately, we anticipate that these applications could improve patient health outcomes and mitigate socioeconomic burdens among families, communities, and societies affected by Parkinson's and related chronic progressive illnesses. So now I'd like to introduce the team, the wonderful team with which I'm working. Myself and Devon are working on this project. So first is Ludmila Lakova-Bennett, who is a linguist and semiotician at Palacky University, Olomouc, as well as Charles University in Prague in the Czech Republic. Now, some of our principal investigators, include Edna Andrews, who is an anthropologist and linguist at Duke University, which is in North Carolina here in the US. Elena Calagari, who is the co-founder of SageRight, which is an AI biotech company, which is based in Reykjavik, Iceland. Yogi Handlin, who is a professor of biosemiotics and philosophy, environmental philosophy at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. Massimo Leone, who is a semiotician at the University of Turin. Mark Mehu, who has joined us for the webinar, who's a psychologist at Webster Vienna Private University in Austria. Jamin Pelkey, who's a cognitive linguist at Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. And Noel Theodosiou, who is the principal for Luminous, which is a consultancy firm based in Boston, Massachusetts. And then, of course, Devon, who will later introduce himself a little more in detail, who's at the University of Vienna, and he's a resident expert in facial behavior, along with Mark. So, health semiotics, a meta-disciplinary approach. So, typically, Parkinsonian motor symptoms include tremor, rigidity, postural instability, and bradykinesia. And bradykinesia is the sort of slowing down of movement. In MAST, we concentrate on hypomimia, that is, reduced facial behavior expressivity. Hypomimic symptomology in Parkinsonian disease is a common feature and clinical hallmark that significantly impacts the patient's social wellness and sufferer's quality of life. For instance, affective experience and emotional cognition achieved through facial expression are increasingly impaired by PD progression. And this in turn frequently leads to social discrimination and disease stigmatization. The meaning and value of the hypomimic sign, as researchers have found in rural Tanzania and East Africa, for example, is determined not only by its clinical codes, but also by its cultural context. So to significantly improve the lived experience of PD sufferers, it is imperative to also understand the behavioral environment that subjects inhabit. Now, it's estimated that more than 10 million people worldwide live with Parkinson's disease at present. This encompasses, for example, 1.6% of all Europeans aged 65 and older, 2% of all Latin Americans in the same age bracket, and 0.57% of all North Americans aged 45 and older. Interestingly, where relatively low disease prevalence is reported, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, diagnosis and treatment is correspondingly non-existent or at best irregular, according to a couple of papers published on this topic. Now, Parkinson's impairs health-related quality of life with adverse psychological and financial effects for patients and caregivers. In Europe, over 41 million disability-adjusted life years are lost annually due to PD and similar neurodegenerative diseases. The average cost of the illness for a patient with PD in the EU amounts to approximately 21,000 euros per year, increasing to almost 100,000 euros for the most severely affected patients. And in the United States, these diseases have a total economic cost estimated at about $52 billion per year. There are also environmental risk factors which are not genetic, and these risk factors have led to an increase in rates of PD by 133% over the last 20 years or so. The papers we have actually date back to 1990, so they look at the time period between 1990 and 2001. And indeed, Parkinson's disease incidences, have increased by 18% worldwide between 2018 and 2025. While lesser known, the average age for diagnosis with Parkinson's disease continues to trend younger, which means more people are getting diagnosed at a younger age than previously, due to widespread exposure of populations to environmental pollution, such as microplastic contaminants, among other factors. And the World Economic Forum's long-term project investigating how climate change increases the health and economic burden of non-communicative diseases reinforces this need to address the environmental determinants of PD, among other neurodegenerative diseases. Now, the most current diagnostic techniques for Parkinson's disease can be interminable, invasive, and inaccurate. Advanced medical imaging technologies, including magnetic resonance imaging, or MRIs, myocardial perfusion, MPS, and transcranial sonography, TCS, are expensive and elaborate. Such techniques necessitate a setup ill-suited for the repeated evaluation of neurological diseases and their longitudinal progression. In addition, nuclear medical imaging technologies like PET or SPECT have inhibitive costs and limited accessibility. Such techniques also require trained personnel specialized in equipment and in different radiopharmaceuticals. Non-invasive symptom assessment techniques, which include, for instance, APHA, are therefore highly desirable across medico-technological sectors. The need is great, for example, in coordinated yet decentralized networks of specialized artificial intelligence agents, that is, in multi-agent systems of healthcare, which perform autonomous and assessive tasks across clinical operation domains. Effective computing and e-health technologies have the potential to transform this situation with Parkinson's disease and its diagnostics through early indicating non-invasive symptom assessment on the basis of the face and its affects. Despite clear and immediate significance as an extremely sensitive biomarker and a non-invasive symptom indicator, hypomimia, its pathophysiology, and correlation with other motor and non-motor symptoms remains poorly understood and widely understudied. This deficiency in research is principally due to a scarcity of measurements, both objective and validated, for face and its behavior, both healthy and pathological. What is more, in the MASS project, we propose that quantifications of hypomimia based on artificial intelligence, automated facial behavior analysis, and facts must necessarily be complemented with interpretive multidisciplinary approaches for the behavioral assessment to be meaningful. And of course, the reason for that is, the disease has, yes, a pathophysiology, but it's also embedded within a particular sociocultural system and structure of interpretation. And so you can't have the quantifying of hypomimia stand in and of itself. You also need this interdisciplinary framework by which to understand hypomimia and its significance in context for peoples living with this disease. To generate statistical models and interpret semiotic meanings, as we proposed in our project, one must necessarily consider the scientific and medical ethics and multi-perspectival values that shape an understanding of hypomimic sign and its signification across environmental contexts and lived experiences. Ultimately, diagnosis requires sign interpretation, whether that interpretation is made by a human, a computer, or most probably in modern practice, a human using a computer. In our view, therefore, both computational methods and conceptual models play equally essential roles in APHA. A multidisciplinary approach. From this approach of health semiotics, we critically evaluate the behavioral measurement of Parkinson's hypomimia, as well as the semiotic meaning of hypomimic signs. In this way, the MASS project bridges the enduring segregation across medicine and its applications between the human sciences and the natural sciences, thereby bringing together disciplines that include, for instance, biomedical engineering, cognitive linguistics, empirical psychology, and evolutionary anthropology. Semiotics and medicine have long been interconnected. Thomas Sibioc, one of the founders of biosemiotics, terms philosophy, medicine, and linguistics as the semiotic tripod. Across their intellectual histories, these semiotic traditions have alternated between dependent and independent. Sibioc acknowledges that medicine remains the uneven leg upon which semiotics rests. Indeed, the very terminology of semiotics itself exemplifies the extent to which diagnosis of disease and the study of science have developed synchronously as scientific disciplines. For 2,000 years, semiotics meant prognostics or diagnostics in medicine. Looking back at the history of ideas, numerous philosophers have stated this sort of observation. And so, the prognostic vision that we envision with our project is trying to find sort of a unity between these what may feel like separate endeavors between sort of the social sciences, the linguistics, and semiotics. We try to see these three tripods, these three legs of the tripod, as something that's whole, and that our project is contingent upon for understanding what it is that we're looking for. Through semiotics, although semiotics originally advanced through medicine, it has also been recently applied to medicine. Van Ixcal, a medical doctor and medical philosopher who pioneered both psychosomatics and biosemiotics, defines the difference between semiotics in medicine and semiotics of medicine as the difference between investigating the meaning of science for illness and investigating medicine itself as a science system. That is, what signs that make the interaction between patients, physicians, among other caregivers, and others possible. In a similar vein, philosopher Charles W. Morris, who was here at the University of Florida, who took a behavioral and even a more biological approach to semiotics, describes how semiotics has a double relation with other sciences because it is both a science among the sciences and an instrument of the sciences. The utility of semiotics for the unification of science, in Morris's estimation, derives from how semiotics is a general language applicable to any special language or sign. It is therefore applicable to science and the signs which are used in science. The call for not only a medical semiotics grounded in cultural semiotics, but also a health semiotics grounded in biosemiotics has been steadily increasing since the late 20th century and the early 21st centuries. This paradigm shift has parallel similarities, of course, with the recent turn from medical humanities to health humanities. In the semiotic metadiscipline and its many subdisciplines, cultural semiotics addresses the ways in which social conditions and societal contexts, which the medical sciences refer to as social determinants of health, affect not only language but also how we live with the triad of unhealth. Disease and the triad of unhealth consists of disease, illness, and sickness. Whereas biosemiotics accounts for the role and importance of the individual organism-environment interactions, and environmental physiology within such meaning-making. That is to say, health semiotics centers around not only the verbal semiotic, but also the nonverbal semantic or somatic. To develop a connection between medical science and biosemiotics, the leading scholar in semioethics, Susan Petrelli, proposes a great responsibility for the semiotician. And it poses a great responsibility for the semiotician because doing so goes beyond theoretical reason into practical reason, and thereby confers upon the study of science a commitment that is not of an ethical nature because it concerns the health of life. For health semiotics of this Parkinson's hypomimia, masked facial expressivity constitutes not only an indexical symptom, but also an interpretive sign. A symptom is non-arbitrary in relation to what it stands for, and indexical or directly motivated by its object. But it is also dependent for its semiotic meaning on inclusions within a system of science, that is, a code which points to a disease or labeled disorder. By explicating the ways in which the hypomimic sign, with all its many functions, processes, and relates, is determined by combining both objective, systematic, and quantitative analysis and subjective, qualitative interpretations. The MASS project thereby promotes an applied biosemiotics in medical practice. With that, I hand it over to my colleague Devon, who will take us through section 3 and 4, beginning with the quantifying hypomimia through behavioral measurement. Take it away, Devon.
Thank you so much, Brian. Absolutely lovely. And thank you all for both participating in the panel and attending the presentation. And we'll now carry on. The study of hypomimia must, by definition, begin with and build upon the behavioral measurement of human faces, their morphological structures, and movement dynamics. For this purpose, FACS is certainly recommended, if not absolutely required. First published in 1978, substantively revised in 2002, and with a new edition currently under development, psychologists Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen's approach to behavioral measurement is intellectually indebted to cognitive science, mechanistic ethology, and pragmatist biosemiotics. A comprehensive system for the measurement of all possible, visually distinguishable facial movements. The usefulness of FACS lies in it being anatomical, descriptive, non-invasive, objective, and standardized. Today's world-leading measurement system, FACS supports the medium-term reliability of study outputs and long-term verifiability of study impacts. By the late 1960s, Ekman had begun to explicitly model facial behavior as a multi-message, multi-signal semiotic system. Ekman's seminal paper, and the foundation for his FACS, appeared in 1969 in the premier issue of Semiotica, the journal of the International Association for Semiotic Studies. As Ekman himself writes, over the years, he proposed a number of different phrases to distinguish his approach to facial behavior and its temporal dynamics, but hoped that terms taken from semiotics would allow a more lucid differentiation. Indeed, in this paper, Ekman references semiotic works by pioneering semiotician and philosopher of science Charles Morris, and he published this paper through his relationship with Thomas Sebeok, one of the founders of biosemiotics. Although Ekman grounded FACS, at least in part, on semiotics, the importance of semiotics for Ekman and FACS has been entirely neglected in emotion studies and technological studies, and largely neglected in the semiotic literature, where it receives only passing but persistent reference. In the 50 years before the invention of FACS, the research and development of various systems for scientifically measuring the complex dynamics and informational richness of nonverbal behavior, as William Wynne points out, came about mainly through a de-emphasis on inferring the meaning of an expression and an increase in emphasis on direct description. By the early 1970s, psychological science researchers such as Ekman and Friesen found it increasingly necessary to establish what Marion Stewart Bartlett calls objective coding standards. Now, overall, he de Lausberg observes there are three general types of objective coding systems for measuring nonverbal behavior. There are those that measure changes in movement behavior, register the quality, the quantity, and the concept of a movement, and compare pathological to normative movement behavior. Then there are those that measure the movements according to function and attribute a specific psychodynamic function to a particular movement class, whether this function be affective, cognitive, interactive, or beyond. And then there are comprehensive descriptive coding systems that refer to the visually perceivable aspect of movement behavior and describe not only what type of movement is performed, but also how it is performed. FACS falls under this last category. Medical researchers into Parkinson's hypomimia apply FACS in their studies precisely because it is objective and comprehensive. What is more, the tacit basis in FACS on metadisciplinary biosemiotics intersectionally supports its ready integration with diverse theories of behavioral interpretation. So to measure the face using FACS, a human, a machine, or human and machine together, then scores one or more out of a total of 44 individual action units. In addition, facts include supplementary codes such as action descriptors, eye movement codes, gross behavior codes, head movement codes, and even visibility codes. As Ekman and Friesen describe, AUs have an anatomical basis, but do not necessarily correspond to a single muscle and do possibly correspond to more than one muscle. These minimal units of facial behavior, when specified in combination, can account for any total behavior. That is, the facial behaviors that Ekman and Friesen term facial events are measured as configurations of AUs, whether a single AU or AU combination, with an intensity of action for every AU. Intensity ratings for each AU are annotated by appending letters A through E from trace or very slight, A, to maximal or strongest possible, E. Applying facts, as Joseph C. Hager specifies, the categorical units of the AUs describe what activity occurs, and the scalar units of the intensity ratings describe how much it occurs. Based on these fundamental measurements and the dynamic analysis of their corresponding magnitudes, time durations can then be derived with timing scores that segment the actions into onset, apex, and offset. At its most basic, as Lotus characterizes in the context of body movement coding, a behavioral annotation of an audiovisual medium is a textual label or tag associated with a segment of video. Any use of facts, therefore, relies upon the measurement annotation of nonverbal behavior by the linguistic modality and the textual mediality in audiovisual media documents of dynamic facial behavior. So using facts, just to exemplify, with a behavior that is widely considered to be an enjoyment smile, or a so-called Duchenne smile, named after the 19th century French neurologist Guillaume Duchenne de Bouillon, who first described the facial behavior. A coder would annotate AU6, cheek raiser, and AU12, lip corner puller, as well as, if the mouth opens, AU25, lips part. With possible attendant intensity ratings, this behavior annotation could be textually represented, for instance, 6C plus 12D plus 25A. Now, in such a smile, anatomically speaking, the zygomaticus majoris facial muscles constrict posteriorly and superiorly, pulling the lip corners upwards, while the orbicularis oculari pars lateralis facial muscles constrict laterally, raising the infraorbital triangle, lifting the cheeks, and gathering the skin medially toward the eye sockets from around their lateral edges. With these crow's feet, as they are idiomatically known, dynamic lines of facial skin then form perpendicularly to movement direction of muscle contraction. Now, in terms of affect, the enjoyment smile with not only AU12 lip corner puller, but also AU6 cheek raiser has been shown to convey more genuine happiness than similar behaviors. So facts is anatomically based as well as theoretically neutral. This contrasts significantly with other such measurement systems, both historical and contemporary, including the 14 techniques for measuring facial actions invented over a span of 55 years between 1924 and 1979 that Ekman himself has surveyed. As Ekman attests, employing terms from semiotics, facts is an approach for measuring the sign vehicles that convey the message, instead of making interpretation judgments about one or another message, and for classifying descriptive units instead of inferential labels. So by way of analogy, facts-based automated facial behavior analysis is to facial behavior as the ruler is to distance or the clock is to duration. It is a measurement device, instrument, or tool. However, as with the ruler and with the clock, facts-based AFBA does not measure a quantity per se. It is used to measure the relative observable change in continuous facial behavior. That is, facts AUs constitute an interval scale and its intensity ratings together classify data into ordered categories where this order matters. The levels of intensity are ordered on a continuum of magnitude, but the levels are not equally spaced. What is more, the 0 point on this measurement scale does not express the absence of a quantity. There can always be some level of electrical tension in the facial muscles, even when at rest, which could be measured, for example, by electromyography or EMG. So simply put, Facts describes what the face can do in terms of its muscles and their movements, rather than what it should do, according to one or another theory about behavior. Eric L. Rosenberg, the psychologist who worked with Ekman in his human interaction laboratory at the University of California, San Francisco, suggests that it is this neutrality that's the principal reason for the staying power of facts and the spread of its influence. Facts affords essentially for a theory-free measurement system. This is one of its main advantages. Facts can be used for the measurement of behavior. However, theory then must be used for the interpretation of this measurement. So in our mass project on Parkinson's hypomimia, for example, we draw upon insights from anthropology, biosemiotics, linguistics, and psychology, among several other disciplines. So beyond its neutrality then, facts offers unique affordances for what I've termed in other writings, facial chronometry. Indeed, perhaps the most distinctive feature of facts is that it provides support for specifically probing the temporal dynamics of facial behavior. Prior to facts, as Ekman reviews, only two different facial behavior measurement systems held a provision for timing of action, including Carol E. Izzard's maximally discriminative facial movement coding system, or MAX, and Ekman's own earlier facial affect scoring technique, or FAST. But these systems both only allowed for start-stop measurements. FACS is the first behavioral measurement system for what might colloquially be called face time, which includes, for instance, both counting frequencies of facial actions and comparing magnitudes of facial dynamics. Of course, FACS in and of itself has significant constraints for time measurement. When integrated with AFBA, however, it can provide frame-by-frame probability estimates for the absence or presence of an AU, its intensity, and timing. The measurement of time is particularly relevant for medical studies. Facts-based APHA, in turn, has opened the door to as-yet undiscovered knowledge horizons for the study of the face, both in neurodegenerative diseases, like Parkinson's, and in kinesthetic symptomatologies, like hypomimia. So across today's medical sciences, facial masking is widely accepted as an extremely sensitive biomarker and a non-invasive symptom indicator. PD was originally documented in Western medicine during the 19th century, although textual fragments about such a neurodegenerative disease can be found in ancient China and India. In 1817, English surgeon James Parkinson, after whom the disease gets its name, first classified what he called the shaking palsy, or paralysis agitans, characterized in part by involuntary tremulous motions with lessened muscular power, in parts not in action and even when supported. Then, in subsequent decades, English neurologist William Gowers, among others, goes further to describe hypomimia and its adverse effects on affective experience. The facial muscles seem to be unable to respond to the varying changes in emotion. The expression on face is a fixed, anxious look, unvaried by smile or frown. 100 years later, the several diagnostic scales developed for PD, its severity and progression, explicitly address this hypomimia symptomatology. These diagnostic scales either directly rely upon facts or can be readily integrated with it. So the most common used scale in the clinical study of PD is the original Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, released in 1987, and its updated International Parkinson and Movement Disorder Society revision, published in 2007. This 5-point scale quantifies Parkinson's facies with a rating score from 0, or normal, to 4, severe. That is, from a normal facial expression to masked facies, both with severe or complete loss of facial expression and with lips parted most of the time, even when the mouth is at rest. The recent instructions to examiner read thusly: observe the patient sitting at rest for 10 seconds without talking, also while talking. Observe eye blink frequency, masked faces or loss of facial expression, spontaneous smiling, and parting of lips. Now, of course, patient-doctor communication is more artificial than natural. It can provoke anxiety, dissociation, and stress in the patient. Consequently, a medical examination may not result in significant amounts of facial expressivity, independent from whether or not the patient has a neurological disorder or neurodegenerative disease. These conditions for measurement, therefore, are far from optimal. In addition, with the MDS, UPDRS, there's no comparison standard for the doctor to employ. That is, the doctor may well be seeing the patient for the first time, and they may have no benchmark or reference for what constitutes a baseline or normal level of facial expressivity for this particular individual in this particular case. As Eduardo Bianacini and his co-authors argue, such an assessment suffers from subjective evaluation, the bias of high inter and intra-rater variability, and a limited 5-point scale that is not sensitive enough to detect subtle changes in patients' conditions. Moreover, the analytic context of a medical interview is not particularly conducive to spontaneous expressivity, as facial behavior is specifically sensitive to social situations. So then another commonly used scale is the interpersonal communication rating protocol for measuring individual expressive behavior. It's Parkinson's disease version, first published in 2004 and last updated in 2010. Now here, from a social ecology perspective, the scale was designed to measure nonverbal and verbal expressive behavior during the stream of naturalistic videotaped social interaction. The raters evaluate the facial expressivity in terms of its frequency, that is, how often a behavior or movement occurs, its duration, that is, how long a behavior or movement lasts, and its intensity or degree, which refers to the strength, force, or level and amount of emotion or movement. Applying this protocol, after being trained on recorded video, each rater judges the Gestalt degree of intensity, duration, frequency for 20 types of target behavior or items, including 7 types of facial expressivity, using a 5-point Likert type scale, where 1 is low, 2 fairly low, 3 medium, 4 fairly high, 5 high. The current version of this rating scale includes 4 items, 2, 3, 5, and 6, informed by AUs and facts, with additional items also comparable to AUs, 1, 4, and 7. However, the scale presents on questionnaires a series of statements and range of responses, assigning numerical values to each response option. It is highly subjective. Such recent rating scales for objective assessment of quantitative hypomimia therefore have significant limitations. Both of these two protocols then fail to consider specific facial behavior actions, their intensity or timing. Advances in AI are therefore gaining increasing attention for potential application in PD quantification. The state-of-the-art e-health studies in Parkinsonism and hypomimia that we survey aim to establish quantitative metrics for Parkinson's diagnostic applications, with the medium-term objective to research and develop the metric itself for this very mandate, and the long-term objective to distinguish between Parkinson's facial behaviors and healthy controls. So today, FACS is widely regarded by world experts as the most comprehensive system and the most authoritative standard for scientific measurement of facial behavior. Over the past 50 years, the applications for FACS, or for at least some part of a simplified FACS, have included, for instance, augmented and virtual reality, consumer marketing, deception detection, film and game animation, healthcare systems, human-computer interaction, law enforcement, military perception, smart environments, and social robotics, to name just but a few. Though first and foremost, FACS is intended for scientific research in behavioral science. The applications of FACS in medicine have encompassed, for example, child and adolescent psychological development, the psychopathology of affective disorders such as depression, the effects of Alzheimer's on pain signals, behavioral symptomatology of myocardial ischemia, the social effects of alcohol consumption, and meditation practices, as well as mindfulness training, among many, many other areas. But the main problem with manual coding is that it is highly time-consuming and deeply labor-intensive. The manual coding of audiovisual media is estimated to range from 60 to 100, requiring 60 minutes of coding for every 1 minute of video, or 100 minutes of coding for every 1 minute of video. Simply put, scientific projects on dynamic human facial behavior become infeasible and impractical, if not downright impossible, using exclusively manual coding. Therefore, researchers must integrate automated coding that is then performed, at least in part, by computer and machine. The critical utilization of AI as ruler and clock, analogically speaking, saves resources both temporal and financial, thereby making research possible. However, the main problem with automated coding and research studies of nonverbal behavior on subtle disorders of facial movement is it is error-prone and either fails to recognize a face or misrecognizes its features. Analogically speaking, the stream of behavior is disrupted or diverted. To simplify this problem in terms of a heuristic, manual coding is accurate but slow, automated coding is fast but inaccurate. It's a simplification, but still. Therefore, integration is important for intercoder agreement and intersystem verification toward reliable and robust data. Now, of course, this guiding heuristic and its historical generalization has many caveats. Given bias and error, a machine could well prove more effective than a human, at least in some coding actions and experimental conditions. But this heuristic can still be useful for understanding both advantages and drawbacks in each coding method. So today, many, if not most, out-of-the-box and market-leading AFBA systems used to analyze the human face and its dynamic behavior in scientific laboratories and research studies, they're based on facts. This includes, for instance, not only Noldus's FaceReader, but also Affectiva's AFDEX and even iMotions Facet, where the latter two, recently integrated within iMotions, explicitly rely on facts. However, none of the researchers that we've reviewed in Parkinson's hypomimia apply such systems. Instead, they tend to turn toward open source facial recognition technology and affect recognition technology operative solutions. Most likely, this is due not to enhanced results with transparent white box technology, but to prohibitive licensing costs and research budgetary constraints. Typically, in best practices for scientific research, manual coding techniques and automated coding technology are used in conjunction, as one fills the gaps of the other. Here, the statistical procedures for intercoder reliability and the ratios of such results have been well established by the scientific community, not only by Ekman and facts, but also through numerous basic and applied studies. So now continuing to part 4, some of the benefits and challenges, problems and solutions in facts-based APHA and its e-health applications. So much, if not all, facial recognition technology does not perform optimally on phenotypic subgroups of Homo sapiens with higher melanin pigmentation and darker skin coloration. So simply put, the error rate and false positives are disproportionately high among racial demographics like persons with African or Asian heritage. This functional constraint in recognition performance is as much a technological problem in machine vision and lighting effects as it is a social problem in discriminatory colorism and institutional racism. There are today what computer scientist Joy Brewer-Lamwini terms an algorithmic bias and coded gaze against racial and other diversities in facial recognition technology. Its template images and training data sets. As unmasked by Brewer-Lamwini, who achieved her doctorate at the MIT Media Lab before she founded the Algorithmic Justice League, this bias can result in a differential inaccuracy that ranges from a factor of 10 to 100. Indeed, Brewer-Lamwini served as an expert witness in 2019 before a House Committee of the U.S. Congress on facial recognition, its adverse impact on civil liberties, and harmful effects on minority populations. In Brewer-Lamwini's testimony, she gives voice to the ways in which pale male data sets are being used as something that is universal when that's not actually the case, and it does not represent the full sepia of humanity. Consequently, Brewer-Lamwini herself criticizes there's a propensity to misidentify Black and brown individuals and communities by government agencies and law enforcement when applying facial recognition systems. But the application of facial recognition technology for identification should not be confused with the application of automated facial behavior analysis for analysis. Market-leading out-of-the-box facts-based AFBA technology systems are made available not for government and corporate applications in security or surveillance, but for scientific and research applications in experiment and inquiry. The behavioral measurement of facts in and of itself is general and universal, like with a ruler or with a clock. When facts is integrated into AFBA, however, the classifier may well have bias toward the majority demographics represented in the template images and training data sets. Frequently, for this very reason, AFBA technology systems can be specifically tailored to the individual subject. For example, Noldus's facts-based FaceReader affords an additional feature for participant collaboration and continuous collaboration, and an additional module for East Asian faces. Hypomimia remains widely understudied, yes, and it potentially has different quality of life effects across different ages and genders. This includes, for instance, divergent responses to hypomimic faces both from peers and from practitioners. In MASS, therefore, we suggest that researchers must consider the diversity of demographics in video sampling for databases and statistical analyses of data sets. For example, by applying such technology contextually and differentially, that is, by dynamically calibrating technologies to individual subject baselines. So the ubiquitous application of facial recognition today has raised concerns over accountability and transparency, especially given the overall absence of ethical oversight and the overall presence of scientific uncertainty. For e-health applications of effective computing like APHA, a false positive or a false negative could have adverse, even catastrophic effects on the affected person. The application of APHA, therefore, warrants even further protections. So the principles behind facial recognition technology, as attested by Kelly Gates, a scholar in science and technology studies, necessitate both legal frameworks of privacy rights and ethical guidelines for structural inequality. Foundationally, Gates further advocates the design of these technologies and the black boxes within them needs to be more widely understood at every level of their development. Kate Crawford, a leading scholar in AI and its social impacts, who founded with Meredith Whittaker the AI Now Institute in 2017, acknowledges that complete transparency is an impossible goal. Rather, to better understand the way AI works and its role in the world, Crawford advises requires public and open communication about the material architectures and contextual environments behind AI systems by critically explicating their interconnected relations. Most recently in 2024, for example, the European Parliament adopted the Artificial Intelligence Act. This landmark piece of supranational legislation includes new protections against non-consensual facial recognition technology, emotion artificial intelligence, and automated facial behavior analysis. Here, the member states of the European Union prohibit, for example, the untargeted scraping of facial images from the internet or CCTV footage for use in facial recognition database. The EU bans emotion recognition in the workplace and schools for use in social scoring and predictive policing. Further, the EU AI Act additionally regulates many applications by law enforcement and public institutions because of the high risk to human rights. Within the framework of these regulations, an APHA technology system would be classified as a high-risk AI system due to its significant potential harm to health within the essential private and public services of healthcare. Such an AI system must, in the view of the EU, assess and reduce risks, be transparent and accurate, and ensure human oversight, among many other considerations. So computed facial behavior, given its correlation to other indicators, it constitutes sensitive data. That is, in the global village and surveillance society of the 21st century, with its Orwellian phantasms and panoptical overwatch, the audiovisual capture of individual faces presents personally identifiable information, or PII. The identified signs of Parkinson's hypomimia would qualify then as a special category of personal information. Consequently, this data is subject to the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR in Europe, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, in the United States. the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA in Canada, and many other such data protections. Medical research that applies APHA, such as in MAST, must conform to standard procedures and comply with privacy regulations. These include, just for instance, stored audiovisual data to the extent that is possible should be anonymized and encrypted. Data mappings between facial identifiers and personal information should each be stored independently from one another on encrypted local devices, confidentially accessible only to treating clinicians. Following data minimization principles, only the necessary data should be captured, imported, and analyzed. And personal data that permits identification should be retained for no longer than necessary and then securely deleted. So the real-world application of medico-scientific knowledge across diagnostic procedures and therapeutic practices, however, it's complicated by the fact that the former often relies upon large group samples, for example, in correlational research studies and randomized controlled trials, whereas the latter mostly relies on single individual cases. So neither a computational scientist nor a medical scientist should generalize their results from large samples to single cases, given that disease manifestations can also differ markedly. Nomothetic research, which relates to studying not individuals and experiences, but groups and laws, should only serve to promote evidence-based practice. As the research studies in the preparation of this project have also exemplified, data gathered from large or medium samples can indeed be promising. This APHA data points to the ways in which Parkinson's hypomimia varies across populations, and how this variance could be definitively accounted for by different factors. However, the application of APHA from group samples to single cases would nonetheless still necessitate that variation within individuals also be considered. Person-specific data is paramount for tailoring effective interventions to individual PD patients. Toward this end, nomothetic research could be complemented by idiographic research in the investigation of these variations on the individual level over time. For example, one study has estimated that mental state changes affect some 20% of PD patients, which suggests that patients develop various emotional responses like anxiety or depression, whether caused by or connected with the neurodegenerative disease progression. The systematic integration and sustained interrogation between psychological assessment for mood disorders and behavioral measurement for Parkinsonian hypomimia could potentially therefore provide essential information about PD, its progression, and possible effective treatment protocols. So, as with other diseases that have an organic component, PD manifests gradually over time. The developmental trajectory of PD therefore depends upon a diversity of biological, psychological, and social factors, at least when understood from the biopsychosocial perspective of the medical sciences. In order to study the dynamic interplay across biopsychosocial factors, it would be necessary to carry out longitudinal case studies in which the clinicians take regular and reliable behavioral measurements on the same individuals. None of the studies that we have looked at have done this yet, and logically speaking, all make but a single depth sounding in the stream of behavior. But early indicating and proactive monitoring could still yet become a foundational pillar of personalized care. The systematic approach that APHA promises would be highly beneficial in such PD assessment. For instance, time-variant behavioral measurement could well complement both the patient's self-report data and physician subjective review data. In addition, systematic assessment utilizing APHA could afford quantitative testing of biopsychosocial factors like traumatic brain injury or to subcortical and motor areas. With sufficient data available on the correlation between biopsychosocial factors and the behavioral measurements, facial indicators may alone be sufficient to assess PD, its trajectory and treatment, without relying upon extensive hospital-based equipment. Longitudinal assessment on individual level could also reveal possible causal relations between affective symptoms and specific events. Such data is more difficult to fully establish using cross-sectional research designs. Yet this information is also invaluable when making diagnostic predictions about the future course of a neurodegenerative disease and the patient's response to its treatment, as we attempt here in MAST. Thank you all very much. And thank you, Brian, panelists, and everyone who's attended, and now on to Monica for our critical discourse.
Okay. Thank you very much, Devon and Brian, for your insightful talk. I just want to make sure I have 7 panelists, but I think 2 people are not on board. Dr. Michael Mayer, no, and Panchanan Mohanty. Okay, so I will start now. We have 5 panelists.
I see Michael Mayer as an attendee, not a panelist, if that.
Okay, but he's not, I cannot see him watching us. Okay, so let's start. Okay, I'll call first Dana Arkhipova. She's a researcher in semiotics and studies the impact of artificial intelligence in several interactions. She's from the University of Torino, Italy.
Thank you so much, Monica. Thank you so much, Brian and Devon, for your presentation. And I also see that your work did develop since last time you did present it at the biosemiotics gatherings in Rotterdam. You know, I think your project definitely just in the beginning, and I think so many secondments which will appear in the next 4 years will contribute a lot also to these aspects which maybe today may raise a lot of questions, like, for example, critical analysis of Ekman's theory, or, for example, the fact that facial masking may be present within frame of other disease, like, for example, some disease like autism goes undiagnosed sometimes, especially in female, and they learn how to, you know, cover them up. But sometimes, you know, it's difficult to understand whether, facial expression is indeed directly related to the cause which you study within masks. But I'm sure you will have a lot of time to address it. Obviously, if you want to comment it, feel free. But what I'm curious about is your collaboration with Luminous, because it's not that often happens that there are companies which participate within this type of big projects. And I find it very interesting, especially for dissemination of our research. So if you would like to comment and give more information about that, or maybe if you plan to collaborate with other companies, as you mentioned, also AI-powered startups. So I'm very curious about that aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Let's hear Ramon Esqueda. He's a specialist in applied linguistics and cognitive neurosciences. He's from Mexico.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Brian and Devon. This is fascinating for me. I've been trying to work on applied semiotics, which I find a little contradictory with the origins of semiotics, because as you said, Devon, and I've read something you wrote about this, Hippocrates was one of the first semioticians, and that was completely practical. That wasn't trying to do some kind of idealistic theory of the sign. So I think this is very fascinating because it opens a new way to understand semiotics as a practical endeavor. And I think one of the things you mentioned, I think Brian did, about the way the body and the face have to be treated semiotically from a different perspective than the kind of sign system or linguistic system that can be translated into something conceptual. But we have to approach this in a different direction. And one of the things I loved about your talk was Hippocrates. He was always there. So I think that's fascinating because it takes us in another direction on semiotics. You know, all your graphics that you showed about the Hippocratic system, which semiotics is a much more complex system kind of approach. You know, we cannot rely only on this kind of sign or that kind of sign or this text or that other text. This is much more complex than that. And the other thing that I find very, very interesting, and I would like you to explain a little bit more, is, okay, you spoke about Susan Petrilli's approach to this kind of research and the ethical part of it. But when we take semiotics to this practical level of health issues, that's something else. I mean, our responsibility as semioticians is very big. I mean, I work with marketing people, and when they make some mistake, it's not that bad. And you can always say, well, many things happened there, so I couldn't have a clear perspective on what was going to happen. But when you come to health, you cannot do that kind of thing. And one of the questions that I have is there a correlation between the neural level of analysis on movement and expression? Let me tell you a personal thing. I studied originally music. I was a classical guitar concert player. And then I stopped playing. Nobody knew 40 years ago what was happening. So what happened was, many years after that, I found out that what happened was that my neural structures that moved my right hand were all mixed up. Because when some musicians play very fast and a lot of hours, and nobody knows exactly why, but that kind of thing happens, and your neural areas that move each finger get all mixed up, and they are confused. So you feel your hand stops moving naturally. But it's not a matter of the hand, it's a matter of the brain. And I don't know if in this kind of research that you are making now, is there like a neural basis for this kind of problem? Because that could be very, one of the ways we can go beyond the subjectivity of it to approach a different level of discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now let's hear Elena Pegolo, postdoctoral student doing research in neurology at the University of California in San Francisco. She also specializes in the rehabilitation of Parkinson's disease.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Brian and Devon, for the presentation. A very, very clear presentation and interesting, of course. So I don't have a lot of questions. I just want to highlight some of the points that both actually Daria and Roman had highlighted. So both the interesting part of the multidisciplinary approach of this project that I think is one of the important things and key to this multidisciplinary. It's a very nice aspect of the project, and what else? I think this is mainly it. And and also what also Daria was saying, the fact that you can apply this to other diseases. So not only Parkinson's disease, but unfortunately, like the masking phase or the kind of like symptoms similar to a hypomimia affect other population. And this is like important to like that this project could see like future developments in other diseases. And I don't know if I can like answer maybe partly to a Roman's question about the neural basis, if you don't mind, just because because I studied a bit like the hypomimia in Parkinson's disease. So there are some studies where they use the fMRI mainly to try to highlight brain areas where you can see to see what's the neural basis of this symptom is. The interesting part of hypomimia, I think, is that for years it has been considered only a motor symptom, so only like the bradykinesia aspect, so the slowness of movement that affected the muscles of the face too. So you had like hypomimia because of that. But in the most recent years, they found more studies are finding a correlation between hypomimia and the impaired facial recognition. So patients not only have like hypomimia, but also cannot like recognize faces of other people. So this is, and they found like some correlation on the brain areas that were affected in hypomimia and people that couldn't recognize faces of others. So they say that probably there's also a non-motor effect of hypomimia. So not only given by the only the muscles that are affected, but also there's also some emotional dysfunction that affects these patients. And yeah, so for sure, there's also a part of that, but it's still under study, and it's like a hot topic of hypomimia and Parkinson's disease these days.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Well, Monica, just can I slide one thing quickly?
Sure.
So to all the attendees and panelists, Elena Pegolo is actually part of our team. Initially, she came through as a sort of a consultant, and we've been trying to snag her for about a year and a half. But, she had other commitments. And so, it was sort of, we were figuring things out in the background. But over the last couple of weeks, it's looking like Elena will be sort of joining MAST more formally. And so Elena is one of us, and I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you.
Let's hear Euripides Santides, Professor of Graphic and Visual Communication from the Cyprus University of Technology.
Hello, everyone, and congratulations, Devon and Brian. Fascinating, amazing, very impressive research and work. What I would like to ask you is regarding the nonverbal categorization of facial masking, and how do you categorize it? I mean, how do you make patterns of nonverbal groups? And then how do you assign meaning to these patterns? Once you have like a specific facial expression, do you like try to interpret it in what context? And when you interpret this specific categorization of facial movements, do you also see correlations between these findings, as well as, if I am allowed to add something further, because you mentioned other diseases as well, the way you do this work for Parkinson's disease, would the methodology that you follow apply, for example, in cases of depression or autism or slight strokes, for example, and other circumstances? And one final note I made here, once you've done all this research and a line of meaning, two dimensions. Do the origins of your findings, can the origins of your findings be the same, like for Parkinson or depression, facial masking? And finally, how all this research and interpretation and analysis and correlations can be beneficial and useful as proactively and therapeutically for future patients. Thank you very much. Amazing work.
Thank you. Now let's hear Mark Mehu, Professor of Psychology at Webster University in Vienna, and who's also part of the MAST project, right?
Yes, hello everyone. Nice meeting you, Elena, and thanks Devon and Brian for your great talk. Of course, I'm very familiar with all what you discussed. Nonetheless, I'll try to challenge you a bit, mostly because, so as a psychologist, I know less about the semiotic aspect. And one thing that has always puzzled me is the question of meaning, and how would you bring in semiotics theory into studying the meaning of facial expression. Also liked the intervention by Roman, who mentioned Hippocrates, and like saying that in fact with the MASK project we might actually go back to the roots of semiotics. So that is quite nice to hear. And so yeah, so my main issue is there, how do we go beyond the biological aspects? Because yes, of course we can, with say, understand why hypomimia would result from, say, damages to neurostructures, because we know facial expression is connected to like, stimulated by the facial nerves. It has origins in the limbic areas of the brain. So but so beyond, how do we go beyond these biological aspects? And it was because facial expression is not just a mechanical neural process, but also has a big social component. And how do I mean, questions I'm asking you, also asking myself, because I will have to to work on that too. How do we go beyond the biological, and where do we see the dysfunction? Is it mostly like a motoric dysfunction? Would it be a social dysfunction? I liked Elena's comment about the fact, well, the recent findings that people with hypomimia are also affected by, I mean, their facial emotion recognition is affected. That also speaks to the facial feedback hypothesis, where, okay, if you are not able to move your own face, are you then not able to recognize other people's expressions? So that's a bit the idea. So there will be a lot of fascinating things and from multiple sources to integrate into our approach. So yes, that's basically my comment / question. How do we go beyond biological?
Okay. Thank you to all the panelists. Before I hand the floor over to Brian Devon, I also have a question. Have you come up with a new chart which is more comprehensive than the two that you showed about how to diagnose Parkinson? Okay. Brian Devon, please.
Sure. Maybe Devon, I don't know how you want to do this. I listed
Easier
everybody.
than I, rather than pieces.
Sure. We'll bounce around. Daria, starting with you, really Luminous, a lot of that has to do with Yogi. Yogi was very instrumental in helping us connect with Luminous. And I know that you follow Luminous on LinkedIn as well as I. And it's quite interesting to see some of their posts. In fact, while you were asking the question, I pulled out one of their posts, which I think exemplifies why they're such an integral part of our collaboration. It goes, and I quote, "Health outcomes are not just clinical. They're shaped by what people believe, what they fear, who supports them, and whether the system was built for someone like them. The biopsychosocial model helps us see these connections and reframe success in healthcare, compelling the industry to work cross-functionally." And I think that really captures sort of the spirit of Luminous in terms of its semiotic and biosemiotic thinking, because they have tremendous respect for the biomedical approach, and they see the value in it, as I'm sure most of us on the panel do. But kind of tying with what Mark was saying, they recognize that that's not the be-all and end-all of the story, especially when you're looking at the sort of the social effects that come from these sort of, let's say, neurological effects that have an impact on, say, facial masking or emotion recognition, et cetera, et cetera. And so I enjoy really partnering with them. I really like Noelle. She's a lovely person. And it would be nice to see collaborations with others in the private sector and with companies like Luminous or biotech companies that have the same sort of sensitivity, because I think that's where the bridge is between those who are academically inclined, clinicians, private sector, academic sector. Though that's fertile ground for continued collaboration. Devon, do you want to add, or do you want me to just go rattle through the list and then you do your own?
Probably if you go through, then I'll go through all. It's probably smoother.
Okay, awesome.
Go for it.
Roman, your question had to do with neural behavioral correlates. I think, Elena, thank you very much for taking that. Elena knows a lot more about that than I do. And then in terms of applied semiotics, I'm trained as an anthropologist, and we're struggling with the exact same question of what exactly is an applied anthropology. And you meet a lot of challenges for numerous reasons that we're not going to go through. But I think that, kind of to the point that you were making, semiotics, I think a lot of us who are in semiotics see the value that it has. But if, for example, we're going to communicate cross-sectorally with companies like Luminous or entities like Luminous, then there needs to be an emphasis placed on how we can take the incredible theory and ideas that we've generated within semiotics and meet people where they are, meaning translating that into something that's applicable And applicable could be in a whole host of contexts. I mean, for us, we're interested in the medical biosocial. But I do take your point that this sort of opens maybe not new frontiers, but it stimulates a conversation where we start to think, okay, we've got this incredible corpus of literature. How do we make it accessible to non-semioticians, and how do we use it to inform important discussions, whether they be policy level discussions or things more in the biological or biomedical realm in terms of the actual science, sort of behind the scenes, et cetera, et cetera. That's the best I've got. We can have another sort of conversation and talk about it and muse, but that's what immediately came to mind. Elena, your point was on multidisciplinary collaborations. Those are the most fertile as far as I'm concerned. And part of the reason why MAST came across, so a little bit of the lore with MAST is basically an anthropologist and a primatologist were wondering how faces and laws combine, empirical linguistic laws. And that birthed what became MAST, because I must say, at the University of Florida, we do relatively well at fostering literally physical spaces, because a lot of this is physical just because of the nature of human beings. Physical spaces where people are very different get together and talk. And what ends up happening is you find out that there's a lot of things that you kind of have, a lot of topics you have in common, but you come at them from different areas. So I'm not a primatologist. I wasn't thinking about these things primatologically. I have a linguistic background, so I was thinking of empirical laws purely linguistically. But because I have a friend, Sid Satichandran, here at the University of Florida, who's also sort of got this broader multidisciplinary sort of bend. We found areas of commonality, and that's how MAST got born. And then we found Elena, a biomedical engineer and biomedical student. And then we found Devon, who specializes in faces, among other things. And then Mark, who's a psychologist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's very important. On the point on future diseases, yes, I mean, Alzheimer's immediately comes to mind, which has a similar pathophysiology. The reason MAST, the D in MAST, the neurodegenerative disease. It's not a one-to-one change. But the reason we focus on Parkinson's within the broader scope of neurodegenerative diseases is simply because hypomimia, from what I understand, the hypomimic literature is a little more developed, at least in terms of drawing a causal connection between hypomimia and Parkinson's, relative to anything else that I've seen. And also because of this phenomena of bradykinesia. Now, Elena can speak better to this, but I've seen that the literature also refers to hypomimia as facial bradykinesia. And I don't know if that's a historical thing or if that's still going on. But the reason that piqued our interest as MAST was coming along is because there's been a couple of really good papers. Heason et al. 2019 is one of them. She's a primatologist. Unfortunately, I forget where she is, but she was one of the first people who noticed that primate gestures also adhered to certain statistical regularities that derived from linguistics originally. And so when we were interested in questions surrounding MAST, we thought, okay, let's start with the face because that's easy. Okay, that's Parkinson's, hypomimia. But then we're also interested later on in expanding to a more full body analysis, which also has to do with gestural movements. And there was that sort of logical through line in terms of our assumptions and our methodologies and the way that gestures are coded, which is not exactly like facts, but is similar in logical structure to facts. And so that's kind of why we settled on hypomimia, on Parkinson's. There were numerous reasons that made it a great candidate for the sort of study we were interested in. But yes, it does open avenues to other neurodegenerative diseases that present in a similar fashion. I'm sorry, I forget how to pronounce your name, my friend.
Everybody's.
Yes, apologies for that.
Too Greek for you.
Yes, yeah, I struggle with Greek names. But your question, I believe a couple of them. The first one had to do with how we group the sort of faces and facial expression. So Sid and I are finishing up a paper that found adherence to these empirical laws among rhesus macaques, which is a non-human primate. And of course, you can't ask the rhesus macaque what it's doing necessarily. I mean, you can get there through proxies, but they don't speak English. And so we had to figure out a means of defining facial expressions. And we simply just defined an expression as the co-occurrence of action units in a given time. And so that was a good bottom-up ethological definition of a facial behavior, a facial expression, because we were also worried about superimposing sort of the human interpretation of a facial behavior onto a non-human primate. And so it was better for us. In fact, I have the quote because Devon's work was very helpful here, but in one of Devon's papers, one that came out in 2023 in Semiotica, he mentions that FACS was developed to describe precise descriptive units of which are underpinned by facial muscle movements or action units, rather than inferential labels, allowing researchers to measure the sign vehicles that convey the message, rather than making interpretive judgments about what one or another of those messages means to conspecifics. And that's really kind of like the basis. We were interested in the sign vehicle, and as MAST becomes fully active, the sort of second part of that question will become important if we're looking at social embeddedness, because then the interpretation of the hypomimic face becomes important, specifically if we're starting to talk about how you reintegrate patients with Parkinson's back into the social fabric from which they come from. Depression and strokes. I know nothing about depressions or strokes apart from having my own sort of moments of feeling depressed and feeling like I'm going to fall over from this PhD. So I can't help you much with that, unfortunately. How beneficial and proactive can these therapeutics be? Well, I mean, so Ludmila, who's our project coordinator and our friend, she attended a workshop on what was it, Devon? Was it the dance, Parkinson's and dance? Because these things are embodied, right? Part of the reason why I think our project is so interesting and special is because it does take a very embodied cognition approach to Parkinson's. And so yes, there are things going on at the neurological level. Yes, there are things going on at the physiological level. But when you're talking about therapeutic interventions that assist people, something that a year or a half ago, like dance and certain dance therapeutic interventions that may be sort of informed by our work, I would have never thought about that. It would have never occurred to me that dance is an actual therapy that works. It appears to be. And so I think that those are areas that we can come in. And as we refine our methodology and we learn more, there may be other sort of, let's call them, I don't want to call them higher level, but you could say at the neurological level, at level of first articulation, level of second articulation from a linguistic perspective. We may have other interventions that come about at those levels, but that was something that immediately struck me as sort of salient to your point. Mark, how do we go beyond the biological aspect? Well, this is where the anthropological training really comes in handy, because there's a very famous case study that's taught in medical anthropology with a group in sub-Saharan Africa. And there were these medical clinicians and medical people who went in and they were trying to introduce a medicine against some viral infection. The specifics I'm lost on, but I'm not lost, but it's been a while, so I'm not as clear on. But I've got the broad story. They went in there with this intervention, and they had a pill that would combat a disease that was growing in prevalence within the region, and they found that no one would take the pill. And they spent millions of dollars marketing, not marketing, but developing this pill and trying to get people out there, et cetera, and nobody would take it. Through long-term ethnographic fieldwork, we learned why the group of people in question wouldn't take it. It was because the pill was blue. And it turned out that within their local cosmology, you were not to ingest certain things, and blue was a suspicious color. And so they changed the color of the pill into a different color. That was the only sort of artificial change they made. And lo and behold, people started taking the medicine. And I think that's an analogy to going beyond the biological aspect for our work, because yes, we are interested in quantifying hypomimia. It is one of our mission statements. But again, the hypomimic phase is a sign embedded within a broader sign system. And so the question then becomes, okay, how do people understand the hypomimic sign, both people with Parkinson's disease, but also their caregivers, their families, their friends, their kin? And again, our colleague Ludmila has a personal story on this, which she shared at Erasmus University, that has to do with her father, who also has Parkinson's disease, and the challenges that their family had to deal with before he got diagnosed. And some of those were pretty significant challenges that were threatening the fabric of the family. But once they had a diagnosis and they understood hypomimia and they understood the father had actually changed in some measurable way, then, they could start working through it, which they did. So I think that, and then the other point that you made was, or question was, where does the dysfunction lie? And that is, that is a question that, it's an excellent question where the honest answer is a bit of a cop-out, but it's true. It tends to lie at all levels of social and biological analysis. With Parkinson's, yes, it does lie within the specific individual, their facial anatomy, their neurocognitive architecture, there are things going on there. But the dysfunction also lies when you have somebody who no longer fits within their cultural and normative script. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to perhaps expand the cultural script so that it's more inclusive of these people who have who suffer from this disease or have this disease. And that might be through awareness. It might, who knows what kind of mechanism you use to do that. But that is I think that the question of ways that dysfunction is going to be very important for us as we go forward. And I think that this multidisciplinary thing, which Elena pointed out and which everybody here recognizes, is going to be important, because that's a question that isn't going to be necessarily answerable just to the biomedical engineering world. It's going to be something where people perhaps will have a little more social sensitivity. A trained anthropologist, for example, not to say biomedical engineers are not socially sensitive, that's not the point, but having people who have these more broad trainings will definitely come in handy. The last point on Monica. Monica, you asked about the chart. Will we be developing one? I don't think we've had an internal conversation about that. I'm assuming we will if we stumble upon something that we think is worth saying and mentioning. I mean, we are trying to, in a way, go beyond those diagnostic measures because of the subjectivity there, which Devon really laid out very well. And they are still really predicated on, this clinical setting where someone who presents Parkinson's symptoms such as hypomimia walks in, and there's an interpretive assessment on the basis of, the clinician in question. But they may be, in fact, I would wager to say there are imperceptible, subtle changes there that cannot be caught with the naked human eye in a clinical setting. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to provide. And if that leads to a lovely chart of a similar nature, then we will do that. And if it doesn't, well, we're going to have some pubs criticizing MD, UPS, PRS, and I'm kind of scared of that. But we're going to do it anyway because, you follow what's true. That's it for me. Devon, please take it away.
Thank you, Brian. Absolutely superb. I will simply maybe follow through each set of questions and try not to duplicate it all and just supplement. I mean, I think you covered everything, Brian, but I'll try and add to that a bit. So regarding, for Daria, the question of sort of the corporate integration, I mean, at this stage, we've got Luminous, we have SageRight, we have had conversations with other corporate entities, either as prospective partners or at some stage. But essentially, at this stage, MAST has been awarded this Marie Curie Staff Exchange Grant, but that is conceptualized as one phase among many of the overall vision of the project across 5 years, a decade, longer. We have already, in a sense, passed phase 1 as a proof of concept as individuals or subsets of individuals within the kind of rhizomatic network of what mass has become. So Brian and Sid with their linguistic law and empirical law research, I with the focus on face, Mark in the lab, Alina with Parkinson's and hypomimia specifically. So we all have different stages of that proof of concept, and then coming together, that gives us that foundation. This grant then is that basic science side where we're doing various specialized trainings, where we're beginning with data sets that are found data sets using online video. They're not yet with human patients. We're doing the statistical analyses side of the empirical laws to get, those baselines and proofs of concept. And then later on, we picture further stages. And that's, I think, also largely more where the corporate and medical institutions will take a larger role of how we're at some point doing clinical testing, at some point taking the data sets we develop and applying them more in the wild or with human subjects and testing them there. So there'll be, I think, different levels of that engagement with different entities. I mean, for example, we've had talks from the beginning with the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and for Parkinson's research in New York. They are not part of the grant per se, but we've been meeting with them, and they have their own sub-grants with different data sets for testing and on. And so we envision that spiraling further. Then building into Roman, your questions, part of that, both the applicability and maybe the neural correlate, is we also picture that being scalable over time in different ways. One is multi-modularly. So we have chosen to start with face. We have chosen to keep that to Parkinson's and to hypomimia. We do very much envision that going beyond Parkinson's and going beyond hypomimia, to include both nonverbal and even verbal elements. So gestural, gait analysis, the gestural coding system, NEUROGES, that we're also going to be training in and working with as a group, is integrable with FACS, with the face coding. Unlike FACS, the gestural coding very much emerges from neurologic disorders, whether that's injury often or illness. I mean, it's sort of different things. But so the gestural coding has a much more direct neurological one-to-one relation, and established in the literature. Eye tracking is also a significant part of like hypomimia, and also you see that even more, not even more, but differently so with other illnesses, whether that's Alzheimer's, whether that's Asperger's, depression, seizures. For example, I mean, seizures, whether that's, well, of all different kinds, but you tend to get movement from across hemispheres. I mean, so you might then see that inactivation of the face from unilaterality to bilaterality. The way the facial muscles are wired, if you will, to the brain, the difference between having bilateral wiring with the lower face, so we have more volitional control, versus the upper face, which is unilaterally wired, so you get less control. That's why you get Spock in Star Trek, the one-sided eyebrow is more dramatic. That's why we have more control of the lower face intentionally, non-spontaneously, but staged behavior. And you see those aspects. I mean, like with Alzheimer's, you might very much, depending on the stage of progression for dementia, you might have different degrees of volitional or non-volitional control. So the patient might have still pretty fluid non-volitional, where just spontaneously the face is enacting, but they cannot do it on command, and then you see the spasming, and then you see the constraints. Or it might have sort of the masking and freezing at different moments or stages, also with medication side effects even. I mean, so you can also even just track impact of psychotropic medication or treatment protocols. So in answer in part to Daria and part to Roman and also Lena, I mean, that applicability in time to other diseases very much. The expansion across modality to gesture, to eye. Several of us on the team very much have a linguistics, a cognitive semiotics and cognitive linguistics background, integrating the verbal with that. And there are currently some very wide studies that have just recently come out in Parkinson's looking at just verbal. Part of the benefits of coming at it semiotically is not reducing nonverbal to verbal on the one hand, and not separating verbal from nonverbal on the other, right? I mean, neither one of those is useful. I mean, neither reducing nonverbal to, oh, facial behavior is like a language, and these sets of actions are like nouns or verbs, and they're little linguistic units. That is a problem. At the same time, ignoring the role of verbal limits what we're looking at a great deal. Semiotically, each is just a sign system. Not just, but a sign system. And so we're able to incorporate and engage those. I mean, to Euripides' points and questions, Brian, I really loved, especially when you highlighted that bottom-up necessity. I mean, a lot of the discourse around Ekman's research, especially in emotions histories and media and technology studies, does not separate the body of research on basic emotion theory or universal emotion theory and the work on facts that is well beyond that theoretic constraint. That's not to say that theory is right or wrong. It is one aspect among many of behavior with intentionality, with interactivity. But by, well, many of the studies that do exist using facial recognition and analysis on Parkinson's really keep it to the basic emotions. So they are coming in with set patterns of looking at these action units and these behaviors. If anything, that limits what you're looking at and limits the data you're looking at. I mean, so the nice thing about the AUs is we're coming from the bottom up. There's not a priori predetermined pattern. So what then categories emerge from that are facial events, are facial behaviors, are sets of signs, a system of signs. I'm sure at different stages of our body of work, we will need to label those, you know, and correlate those to other already existing patterns in the literature, such as pain, such as sadness, such as, I mean, the body of research using facts with pain is probably one of the widest and well-established within the medical literature. But not constraining that from the get-go, I think, is a really important part here. And that builds, I think, to Mark. And I think this key sentence of where does the dysfunction lie is, I mean, that's a paper title if ever there was one. And for those of us who come from a full semiotic background, there's layers to that sense in part because often a sign is defined as something that can lie. In fact, from Umberto Eco defines it that way, and you know, so a sign is something that is morphing, is multi-perspectival, is multi-agential. And I think part of where then that semiotics comes in is very much coming in multi-perspectivally, is coming in through kind of infinite semiosis frame in Peircean terms. So if we were to, at some stage, visualize, and there are concrete outcomes that we have very much planned. There are video databases, there are coded data sets, there are empirical law patterns. You know, those are the concrete outcomes of this stage of the grant prior to being more broadly interpreted or more widely applied. But if I were to, from a visualization standpoint, I mean, some of the graphics used here are more illustrational than they are tools, and they're more processual than a tool would be. But to visualize, it would be this constantly flowing, morphing, four-dimensional thing where we're taking into account the social, we're taking into account the individual, where you're looking at cultural, societal, where you're looking across a lifespan, you're looking at the interactants. I mean, I think that's one of the sort of classic exemplar problems with facial recognition rather than facial analysis is so often facial recognition is targeting, individual faces and totally forgets the environment. I mean, that's a big part also of the biosemiotic framework, not just semiotics in general. It's taking into account Innenwelt and Umwelt. What's happening in the internal environment, what's happening in the outer environment, what are all the different outer environments. That's not one homogeneous thing. So you're able to look more at the clinical setting if it's with a doctor in a hospital, the family setting. And that brings us then also back to applications. I mean, as we have planned roughly at this stage, this is very much early days and doing empirical law testing and on, but eventually developing then tools. And that might mean provider-centered diagnostic technologies, like ambient intelligence in healthcare. It might mean more caregiver-centered technologies like augmented reality, communication assistance. Before Google Glass went wherever that's disappeared to at this point, there was a company in Germany using face rec with Google Glass for autistic individuals to help with affect recognition, to help with emotional intelligence and conspecific interaction. But then bringing to the dance therapy for Parkinson's and other movement disorders. Funny, that was actually my first contact with Parkinson's, maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, was through dance movement therapy as a tool. But thinking about maybe a smartphone-based app using facial therapy, does working those muscles have an effect on the neural level? Can we not just detect or envision by way of the face, but can we work the other way too? Is that a possible therapeutic tool to help with recovery, to help with whether that's literally on a movement level or emotional interaction level? I mean, so that patients, whether Parkinson's or beyond, can have more full lives with family, with on. That's my question. And then, of course, tools that are more assessment and evaluation. And part of the facial aspect there is the constraints of being in a hospital with big, expensive tech is a very real problem. This is not to say that face then is the only avenue or should be a special or one avenue, but letting that be integrated within all these different aspects and looking to that multimodal dynamic. So, I mean, in terms of where does the dysfunction lie, hopefully by coming at it biosemiotically, rhizomatically in the broader sense, that can be perceived at all those different levels. All might be a bit absurd and ambitious, but at least wider. Then to Monica's point of those two systems that do exist for quantifying those scales, I mean, there are several out there, of course, maybe half a dozen that have been developed in various ways, used in Limitu. I would hope both on the one hand, we don't end up with that degree of constraint. I would be concerned about that we end up with scales per se. But certainly towards ways of visualizing and ways of talking about all those different intersections. The patient across their own experience. I mean, maybe they're coming back to, Roman's point of the benefit of returning to Hippocrates in a sense of remembering that history behind semiotics that's not just medical, but is health. And they're concerned with diagnostic biases, concerned with epistemic injustices, that patients have their voice, that is heard properly, that is integrated well. that the family's observations are not relegated to the side as can so often happen in diagnostic processes. Hopefully that's where some of the health semiotics and biosemiotics can come in, is thinking about it from all those different facets. In concrete terms, yes, at this stage we will have empirical law applications, statistical analyses, data sets, and begin to look at that further in other illnesses and real world tool development. But hopefully throughout that, the semiotics and the diversity of our disciplines can inform looking at it, these things more multifactorially than even the biopsychosocial model. How that comes out concretely, we're not there yet. But there was a question also.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat. I've already answered it, but please feel free to also. So the question, for anyone who hasn't see it, was from Lee Wu, and it was impressive work. Thank you very much. Could you share what would be the direct impact or link of this research to other medical fields other than Parkinson's disease, and also to who or with other fields, social, scientific, aesthetic, etc., other than medical? So my answer basically had to do with, the point that was raised by Elena, as well as Daria, actually, that this could and most likely will go well beyond Parkinson's disease, because there are sorts of there commonalities, there are homologies between how these diseases present. Of course, they are all specific diseases, and so there are differences that are meaningful, and we will make those delineations and those distinctions where appropriate. But autism and Huntington's disease, for example, also seem to have a sort of kinesthetic aspect to them, and so yes, there are applications that go beyond PD. And then, secondly, how do we communicate with, or rather, what other fields could be impacted? I highlighted performance studies, anthropology, and cognitive science, embodied movement-based sort of disciplines and approaches, because you don't want to segment the body beyond what is necessary for analysis or intervention. And so at the end of the day, the body is a full system, and we are interested in conceptualizing it that way and understanding it that way and compartmentalizing it where necessary to make the analytical work useful and helpful. But it always goes back to a body in a social system, and that's where the biosemiosis of all of this comes in. It's an organism embedded in a network of other organisms, and embedded in a network of flora and fauna, material and energy flows, all the lovely stuff ecologists like to talk about.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you take that outcome of statistical laws within a multimodal, embodied 5E behavioral frame, looking at political behavior, if you want to take masked in the wider definition of masked facial behavior in the sense of volitional, staged, false, certainly theater studies, you have facial behavior more in extremis, depending on the theater studies, because it's not necessarily spontaneous. It is controlled, it is by design. Political studies, how that operates are on today. More and more of these recognition tools are also used in aesthetics to look at how audiences are responsive to artworks in museums, or those kind of social interactions with art in different contexts. Disney has an entire neuromarketing wing that looks at audience response to film. That's part of the review process today before films are released, to go, is this working? What isn't working? Certainly there will be models that are outcomes here that could have far wider applicability than even neurodegenerative disease and even medical. Largely, I think, through the multimodal and through the biosemiotic aspect. So infinite relationality. I don't know how it gets modeled fully. We'll see. Not fully, but more. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, you're
Monica,
muted.
you have your
You're muted, Monica.
Let me see if I can unmute you.
There.
There. Okay. So I want to thank everybody who participated in this web seminar, and a special thanks to Paul Buissac, who organized this, and also to Zig New for the technical support. Till next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
great.
you all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.